In these messages this week, I want to go back and keep going back to the scriptures that the congregation has been reading through in this daily Bible reading. And for this segment, I'd like to go back to the book of Psalms, to chapter 38. It's another chapter that's attributed to David. It's classified in commentaries as a penitential psalm. The one that is writing the words is very penitent, very remorseful, very repentant of the things that have happened in his life. And although these verses, are just barely over 20 of them in this chapter, deal with all sorts of problems, it's kind of in a generic kind of way for the most part. And it fits a lot of the different settings that you find David having to face because there's a lot of traumatic events in his life. But you can divide it into sections where he's talking about what it is that he feels and why he feels that way. To begin with, verses 1 through 5. The what of how he's feeling is listed in verse 1 and verse 2. Lord, do not rebuke me in your wrath, nor chasten me with your hot displeasure, for your arrows pierce me deeply. Your hand presses me down. That's what I feel. I feel like I'm just being pushed down because of the righteousness and the power of God. Well, why is that the case? Now, the why behind that is listed in verse 3, 4, and 5. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your anger, nor any health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. So in verse 1 and verse 2, there's a great deal of remorse that David has. But here in verse number 3, 4, and 5, it's the burden that he carries. That's why he has the feelings that he does. But it's interesting that he doesn't blame others. He talks about his sin, verse 3. He talks about his iniquities going over his head, verse 4. He talks about them being a heavy burden in verse 4. He talks about his wounds that are there because of his foolishness. It's not the case that he can blame somebody else. The wrongs that have occurred in his life, he takes full responsibility for. The statement that's made in verse 3, 4, and 5 deals with the burden that he bears. There's an interesting phrase in verse 4, for my iniquities have gone over my head. And in the Hebrew, it almost carries with the idea of, it's like picturing a liquid that is boiling, and as it continues to get hotter and hotter, and the boiling becomes more intense, the level of the liquid rises. So he's suggesting that as he says, my iniquities have gone over my head. I'm drowning, but I'm drowning in something I've manufactured on my own. It's my fault. So I'm remorseful and regret everything that has happened, that has been wrong in my life. It's not God's fault, it's mine. I feel the burden of that sin, and I feel pressed down by the presence of one who is a righteous creator, one who is Lord and God. The second section that deals with, again, another what it is that he feels and why he feels that way begins in verse 6. I'm troubled, I'm bowed down greatly. I go mourning all the day long. My loins are full of inflammation. There is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and severely broken. I groan because of the turmoil of my heart. And it falls into a different kind of category. The very first description of what it was he was feeling in verse 1 and verse 2 was a remorse. This time it's grief. This time it's something that goes beyond just the penitence that he feels. This is something that goes all the way to the very heart of the turmoil that individuals face in difficult days. I groan because of the turmoil of my heart. Why is that the case? Well, the answer is found in verse 9 and verse 10. Lord, all my desire is before you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart pants. My strength fails. As for the light of my eyes, it is also gone from me. His weaknesses. And although these two verses, verse 9 and verse 10, don't necessarily deal with the sins per se that he's committed, it's the result of that, the weaknesses that he knows he has because of the foolishness that he's mentioned, because of the iniquity that is in him, because of the sins that he has committed. And he's grief-stricken because of it. But in those illustrations, what he's not saying in verse 9 is that his desire in all these instances has been for God. What he says is, Lord, you know my desire. My sighing through all of this is not something that's hidden. It's not something away from your sight. My heart pants. It's as though I've gone through so much exercise and running from something that is chasing me that I can't even breathe normally. I can't even be relaxed at all. My sighing is not hidden. My heart pants. My strength fails. I'm exhausted. The light of my eyes has gone from me. It's a picture of an individual that whatever kind of dreams and goals may have been present before, those are gone. Somewhere in the past of our country, there's an interesting individual, one of the founding fathers, who made a statement that a lot of individuals die at age 30 and then just wait for their body to catch up. Have you ever looked in the face of somebody and looked at their eyes and you can see some they have a twinkle? It's something goes beyond the expression. And you can tell that there is a vibrancy about them. And then you look at somebody else's eyes and the eyes look just dull. There's no spark. There's no ambition. They just exist. It's that kind of idea here, multiplied a lot to get to the point that grief-stricken is the only way that David can describe what it is that he feels. In verses 11 down through verse number 14, it's not what he's feeling first, but he gives us the why first, and then what it is that he feels as a result of that. The why, verse 11 and 12, my loved ones and my friends stand away from my plague. My relatives stand far off. Those also who seek my life lay snares for me. Those who seek my hurt speak of destruction. And plain deception is something they speak of all day long. So what does he feel as a result of that? I, like a deaf man, do not hear. I'm like a mute who doesn't open his mouth. Thus I'm like a man who does not hear and in whose mouth is no response. What does he feel? Beyond speaking. Can't say anything. I'm silent. It's almost like I am so astonished about what has happened with those who are my acquaintances that I don't even know what to say. So the reason that he feels that way, because of the isolation that he faces, has caused him not to even want to talk about it at all. I remember a student in high school, graduated just a couple of years after I did, but made a comment. She went to one of the large universities, and then after a semester she came home and did not go back. And she told her parents that that campus was the loneliest place, had to be the loneliest place on the face of the earth. You're surrounded by people, but it's the loneliest place on the face of the earth. There are people who feel isolated in a crowd. Some people who like to be isolated, but there are others who don't know how to reach out. Or when they do, they inadvertently push people away. But in this situation, there are those that should have been standing by David, his friends, verse 11, his relatives, verse 11, are individuals who are not close to him at all. They keep him farther than an arm's distance. And those who seek his life are constantly putting traps out, trying to catch him. No wonder here's one who is grief-stricken, here's one who's remorseful, here's one who deals with life in this heavy kind of way at this point in his life because of the isolation that he feels. And if you continue on down in verse number 15 and following, all the way down to verse 20, the what is in verse 15 and 16. In you, O Lord, I hope. In you, Lord, I hope. You will hear, O Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest they rejoice, those enemies rejoice over me, lest when my foot slips, they exalt themselves against me. So my desire is that God would be there with me all along. Why? Verse 17, 18, 19, and 20. I am ready to fail. My sorrow is continually before me. I'll declare my iniquity. I'll be in anguish over my sin. My enemies are vigorous, they're strong. Those who hate me wrongfully have multiplied. Those who render evil for good, they're my adversaries. Because I follow what is good. So I'm falling, I'm about ready just to fall. I'm not going to be able to continue much longer. And the problem that I face keeps my sorrow continually before me. So I declare my iniquity. I'll be in anguish over my sins. But that still doesn't stop the fact that my enemies are always there and always present. So because of that, please, verse 14 and 15, verse 15 and 16, hear my desire. I want you to be with me. And there's really a request at the very ending of this chapter. Do not forsake me, O Lord, O my God. Be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. It's a chapter that deals with somebody that recognizes his life is in jeopardy almost at every waking moment. And he traces it back to the iniquities that he has in his life. But he still doesn't understand why his family and friends are not close to him. It makes sense perhaps that his enemies are far away, but not too far. They keep trying to place traps in his path so they can actually ensnare him and get him out of the way. Now, while there are a lot of things in this chapter that deal very much, again, back within the time frame, fittingly, of David's running away from King Saul, who wants to destroy him, it still fits some of the situations we face. The isolation that we feel, the pressure that seems to be around us as life is not normal at all. Maybe it's a recognition of weaknesses that we have. Physically, that's the case as people try to stay confined and away from this illness, away from this virus. But David's dealing with a spiritual kind of sickness, a spiritual infirmity. He recognizes that. But even in the midst of that, he closes by saying that he wants to do what is good. Those who are my adversaries are there because I follow what is good. Verse 20. Therefore, verse 21 and 22, please don't forsake me. And we continue to pray for one another. We're mindful of the situation that we face. Our prayers are always there for individuals that are infirm and have problems outside of this pandemic. And we pray that they do not succumb to this virus. May those prayers continue. And may we be comforted by passages, even the passages like this one in Psalm chapter 38, where David again is pouring his heart out because of the problems that he faces, just like we pour our heart out to God for the problems that we face, knowing that he is ultimately the one that's in charge and in control. Interesting chapter. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.